Yes, absolutely. I do. I'm not only European, but I am European because I'm Polish, and I think that makes uh, this is an important factor that we are not Europeans in opposition to our national identity, but being born in nations that are happen to be situated in the on the European continent. By being nationals of these nations, we're also Europeans. And I think for many people it's not very obvious, but this is how we participate in the common culture. But by being raised and by being educated, and our culture, which is inherently European at the same time, and you can't really divide those two things. So yes, by all means, I'm European. So when I was 21, I took a Trans-Siberian train to travel to China. I actually went as far away as Hong Kong and got back. It was really a formative experience in many aspects, but also it was surprisingly formative to my European identity. I wasn't traveling that much before, well, basically only within Europe. And for the kids or the young, well, I was in a high school before, so it was really like discovering a different, exotic, Western developed culture. But only when I went to left kind of European space, so left Russia, went through Mongolia, and then to China, I realized to what extent all these petty differences that we might have, including linguistic ones, didn't really matter. Many people couldn't find Poland on the map, but they identify me obviously as European. When I remember very well the moment when in the hostel room, dormitory, of course, I was traveling on the budget. I came across a Hungarian. I think his name was Bela. So he was a fellow Central European, so it made us even closer. And I almost felt like finding a brother I haven't seen for a long time. It wasn't. It was like, well, 20 years ago, so it wasn't a mass tourism at the time. And honestly, I would say that looking from the outside, only taking a longer view, either historically or geographically, we realize that we really are of the same culture and of the shared political experience, and also of the shared future. So I think that European Union should consider something of a kind of Erasmus experience, but for young adults, so that everyone has a chance to experience being outside Europe and how European you would feel. Not necessarily Polish, German, or French, but exactly a European identity is discovered by being outside Europe. Well, I would look for the very recent history. So I would come back to the referendums in which the constitution, so-called European constitution, was rejected in France and Netherlands. It was just immediately after, well, one of the best moments from my perspective, European history. So introduction of the Central Eastern European states to European Union. And I think it was a very telling moment. I chose this moment for the purpose because I imagine that kind of elitist, or even some would say technocratic project, which European community was in the past, tried through, well, it was forced in a way through referendums to pass the democratic test and to reach out to the citizens. And obviously the EU constitution wasn't a document that was in any way ready for the demos, European demos, or demoses, I would rather say, to be read and especially to be accepted. So it was a ridiculous idea that this kind of document could serve as a new beginning for the European project. And I think to the very large extent, what happened later, so it was transformed into the Lisbon Treaty and accepted, well, with different means. kind of backdoor deals. I think like Brexit, for example, was one of the reasons that it happened. It was that actually this transformed constitution was accepted by different means. And I think it's a very telling lesson. So European Union as an elitist project worked pretty well until a certain time, but looking for legitimacy among the citizens, it cannot carry on as it did. So what would work well for the national elites to bargain and argue about doesn't work for the populations, for the citizens. You have to look for very different emotions, for very different projects. And so this was a failure, definitely was a failure. I think it was the high points of the European integration just after the enlargement, and then it was the financial crisis. So, and high hopes went down. And I would really want us as Europeans to learn from this experience that we are not facing a technical problem ahead of us in terms of European Union. It is an existential problem. So how to move the European projects from the elitist projects to the citizens project, and just changing names or trying to put forward motions to the democratic voting that actually are not prepared for that wouldn't help. Well, I would now I went for the recent history. I would go for, well, not also very not too far away in the history, but only in the mid-19th century. And this is the reason because in 1848, the Spring of Nations happens. And I hope this qualifies as recent history enough, because it was perhaps the only truly European revolution. Of course, as Hobsbawm and others argued, it was an immediate failure in almost all aspects of it. But what was exceptional, it was that the national identities that were being born at the time across Europe, in developed and underdeveloped countries, most of the European continent went through this phase of European Spring. This national ideals, they corresponded with the very European feeling. So you had young Italians, young Germans, young Poles springing around and finding a common cause, which was the fight with the oppressive regimes that at the time ruled over Europe. And even though it was a failure, I would say that the Autumn of Nations, so 1989, was in a way similar. So it was a kind of domino effect in the Central Eastern Europe. But this European Spring, I think, teaches us an important lesson that we should not look for the opposition between national and European identities. That there were times in the history they worked together, and living the nations or national spirits. I don't say nation states, but because nation states should be obsolete, really, at least in Europe. But nations may not be obsolete for any time soon. And using this national emotional power is very important for European project. I wouldn't leave nations to nationalists, because as de Gaulle said, we should not leave war is too important to be left to generals. And I'm pretty sure that redefining what it means to be Polish, French, German, or Latvian is possible for the European lens. So you don't need to be a nationalist to feel patriotic. And I think this patriotic emotions could work as they worked in 1848 for those who want to revolutionize Europe and start perhaps another spring of the continent. Well, I am sitting, you might not see that, but I am sitting in the European Institute, European University Institute right now. Yeah, European University Institute. And well, it is perhaps one of the best world libraries that I can't really make myself living. This institution is just, I mean, the fact I'm here on fellowship, and seeing how many young researchers are engaged into creating the new ideas for European project, I have a feeling that I'm really privileged, you know, and I'm privileged also because I could do Erasmus in, you know, almost 20 or 15 years back. This is for people of my generation, born in 1980s in my part of the world, moving freely, living abroad, and being able to, well, just pay your bills in foreign countries, doing normal work, not illegal, not some kind of illegal jobs, was an impossible dream. And the European Union made it all possible. So yes, I'm very thankful for this intellectual and cultural, let's say, adventure that I'm having a chance to be experiencing right now, and I'm pretty sure that it would last. And there are many people who I think have the same experience. The best things actually in their lives happen thanks to the possibilities made by the being of part of the European community. Right. So I was being ambitious, and I was thinking of European citizenship, but I mean like a real one, in which it will be either on top of the existing nationality citizenships, or something that would actually be introduced for this over 20 million people who are residents in the EU without a citizenship. Or some of them, in some countries, there are people who are for their lives residents of certain countries, like for example Russians in Latvia, but without Latvian citizenship. And being European citizens, I think, would change a lot for them. Also for the immigrants who perhaps cannot become Czechs or Hungarians overnight, but they definitely could become European citizens in the same way that people coming to Great Britain could become relatively easy British, not necessarily English, but they could become British subjects. But maybe that's overtly ambitious. So if we can't do the common ID, a European ID and common European citizenship, I was thinking that at least we could create a common EU library card, you know, so we could open up combine and all the libraries that exist in the EU, and have the access from from an iPhone to all the libraries that exist. Perhaps not only the main ones, but all the university ones and even the minor ones. And so connecting all the readers within the European countries and connecting all the books and all the libraries, maybe not as ambitious as common European citizenship, but perhaps could be more realistic to achieve and actually come back to the very roots on which Europe was founded, so the common cultural heritage. Well, I would say that for the project it's the challenge is maybe bigger than some people imagine, because it's easy to argue that for the European Union we need a better narrative, but the problem is that it seems that our current narrative is bad. It's simply not existent, you know. And the product for which you try to create a narrative is not necessarily the one upon which it's easy to build any kind of story, because it wasn't meant to be. So it wasn't meant to be told not only in the lift, but also, you know, in a tram or anywhere else, you know, or watched on the TV. Watching a documentary about creating EU creation would be actually pretty boring. There are much more documents about Second World War. So I think that it's almost an impossible task to some extent. But on the other hand, we associate European Union with European values and emotions and instincts. So perhaps if in some way you achieve this of injecting the spirits and these emotions from the feelings we have, most of us, either good or bad, for European project into the European Union as such, that would be really great. But narrative itself, I think it wouldn't help unless there are some real political and institutional changes, which would give ground for the narratives for those institutions in the future, as it was with the national institutions. I don't think that why it should be any difference. they are also the creation of the very modern times. That's why I spoke of Europe of Spring, because European Spring was only 19th century when most of the today's countries were born. Yeah, so just just to congratulate you on your on your courage to take up almost an impossible task. Okay, I have this kind of idea that's perhaps will never work, but I imagine that you have to change. Oh, you expect like one word, right? I shouldn't be explaining.
No,
that
just share your thoughts.
So
this is not like a standard question, so this I don't need to break this down.
Sure. I mean, it is like I don't really believe that, as I told you, I could be much more straight. That's narratives for projects that are not meant to. I mean, if you have a politician that is boring, he'll be boring with the best story behind him, right? So it's not going to work. What I think Europe needs in practice would be changing dynamics. So instead of explaining yourself why you're like this and why you're like that, and enabling national, it's very easy to be European, in Brussels, but to be European at home in a small city, that's much more difficult. So I was thinking about completely.
Why is it?
Well, it is like you have to go to the people and explain to them that EU demands this and that, or introduce this and that. And of course there are some things that people appreciate, like roaming, for example, or the passports, which is but still 50% of population of Poland never travel abroad, I think. So not everyone has a chance. But I think what we would need is to change dynamics. So I believe we should try to think about different incentives for especially national political elites who are necessary to go through with the further European integration, which I think is also necessary. So we should be thinking in a way of creating the historical event, the one which you wouldn't miss for all your life. It's some when Americans think about their constitutional moments, or you had British Glorious Revolution, or another foundational moments of regaining your independence. And with EU, we might be thinking that instead of like another summit with notes that no one would recognize, we should think about the gathering of all. I mean, how to create an event of the historical scale, the one in which you actually want to achieve something. You want to go there and to come back to your people and say, yes, we were part of something important. We're not bargaining, we're actually giving something. And we are very happy to be able to. So I was thinking that if you try to gather, because also what you need is a spectacle, right? So it's not enough just to have like 27 people sitting in a conference room. Of course, it will have to be post-COVID. So it's a question, it could be in 2 years' time or maybe 5 years' time. But I imagine that in a place of historical importance, the first that comes to my mind is Colosseum. You imagine that you see thousands and thousands of people getting in. These are all the parliamentarians of each and every one parliament. So representatives of nations, representatives of people, the very directly elected by them, all around Europe, coming in one moment into one place. And of course, perhaps it will be impossible to imagine that it should be almost like 10,000 people or 7,000 people. I don't know. I haven't done the math yet, but a couple of thousands of people. Of course, they will have to make some commissions or committees to agree on details. But I can imagine that the representatives of the nations could be accompanied, of course, by the civic society or European institutions in other chambers. But this parliaments would be able to make on the spot to vote on the very far-reaching European reforms, because when you have a government, the government represents only usually one party or three parties which are in the coalition. The parliamentarians represent like everyone. Of course, not everyone's party made to the parliament, but they're much more representative. And this is, to me, the only way to actually think of representation of the European nations and European citizens, because European Parliament is not seen in this way, because it lacks certain elements that any parliament would have. So I believe that could be a moment in which we would not be bargaining and speculating on the minor additions to European project. We could go really far in this foundational moment, because also every nation that will be represented there, every MP would have this chance only once in their life. Not a prime minister, every MP from every part of Europe. And of course, there will be Eurosceptics as well. But even in countries like Poland or Hungary, you can imagine that there are like, I don't know, 40% of people who are actually opposite the government. They are not represented right now in the European Council. So anyway, I think of the pathos, I think of the grandesse, I think of the going to the very core of European identity, which is Rome. And I think of the win-win situation and emotions and something to give for the nations, and to end the argument that Europe is against the will of the people, that it's not the democratic, that it's against the nation states, because the nations would be represented. And maybe nations will actually move forward with ending the era of nation states Europe into the Europe of nations and Europe of people. So yeah, it's a dream, but it's a dream I hope might become true in my lifetime.